My trafficker was my husband. There was no way I could reach out to anybody for help.
We're scared. We're scared to run. We're scared to tell anybody what's going on.
It was an incredibly violent situation. I felt like there was no way I could get out.
Human traffickers can be just about anyone from any walk of life. A lot of the trafficking involves domestic servitude, hoteliers, restaurant owners, owners of massage parlors, agricultural farm owners.
It can be a trafficker who tells a woman, I want to be your boyfriend, I love you, and if you love me, you're going to go out and have sex for money. It can be kind of psychological like that, or it can be more overt and more physical. It can be hitting, abusing, keeping them away from any support systems.
Trafficking, it doesn't know any boundaries. The victim can be male, female, transgendered, anyone. And it happens all over America.
I still see this attitude of it's just immigrants or it's just people in other countries. It happens to U.S. citizens so much more than people are aware.
The natural stakeholders in this issue are certainly law enforcement, legal advocates, social service providers. There's other players involved as well.
It is important to engage the community because victims often don't self-identify. They don't come forward to law enforcement.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Citizens in the community are the eyes and the ears.
It's medical workers, it's educators, it's personnel at homeless shelters.
We can't do this alone. No one has the capacity to provide every single thing that a victim or survivor of human trafficking needs.
There has to be a support system within the community, psychological counseling, shelter, and vocational education so they can reintegrate, become a healthy individual.
There's an intentional effort to get everyone together so we know how to share resources, we know how to work together, and to make sure at the end of the day, a victim becomes a survivor.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on human trafficking with three fantastic panelists. We're going to introduce you to the panelists, and then we're going to take it from there. We'll give you some information about the CLE as well in a few minutes. But thank you again, everybody, for joining us. This is really our first Life Preservers Project webinar, and we hope to do another one later in the fall. So. Introducing the panelists, our first panelist is Barbara Martinez. Barbara is a member of Holland & Knight's Global Compliance and Investigation Team in the Miami office. She focuses her practice on internal corporate investigations, corporate compliance and training, and white-collar criminal defense. Part of her practice includes offering anti-trafficking compliance programs for businesses. Prior to joining Holland & Knight last year, Ms. Martinez served as the chief of special prosecution section of the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of Florida. In this capacity, she tried human trafficking cases, supervised federal prosecutions who handled cases involving international and domestic human trafficking, money laundering, child exploitation, extortion, international kidnapping, and other transnational crimes. And I'll let Eric introduce our second panelist.
Yes, it was my absolute pleasure to introduce Greg Zazor of the Zazor Law Firm. Greg practices out of Birmingham, Alabama. His practice focuses on complex litigation, personal injury, human civil rights, but where he stands out and shines strongly, in our opinion, is with his work in the anti-human trafficking, child sex abuse, and crime victim representation. His work has been powerful and inspiring. His insight will be certainly an unmeasurable value during this roundtable.
Wonderful. And our third panelist is Robin Hassler Thompson. She is the executive director of the Survive and Thrive Advocacy Center, STAC, based in Tallahassee, Florida. Robin is an attorney and consultant whose work focuses on human trafficking and violence against women. She provides consultation, education, and outreach to key professionals in the justice system, social services, and healthcare, as well as to other community leaders and policymakers locally, nationally, and internationally. So thank you, everybody, again, all three of the panelists for joining us, and I will let Eric take it from here.
And moderating this roundtable is Andrew Kent. Andrew is the COO of Page One Legal, based out of Nashville. Andrew has 15 years of e-discovery and litigation services in the industry. He received his BA from the University of Wisconsin and has his JD at the Catholic University of America. He has hosted numerous webinars, including Virtual One Conference, our 15 on 15s, and litigated lunches. Andrew, please begin.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you for all of our great panelists for coming today. It sounds like some people weren't able to see the video we played on the beginning, so at the end of this session, we will send out materials, a PowerPoint that has that video. Make sure to see it. It is jarring, to say the least, just a really powerful video. So, thank you everyone for coming. Let's go ahead and jump on into the slides here. And we'll do a few slides, and then we'll open up to the roundtable discussion. Again, step into the light. Thank you, Life Preservers Project. You guys do fantastic work. Panelists, what is human trafficking? Human trafficking involves the use of force, fraud, or coercion to obtain some type of labor or commercial sex act. Every year, millions of men, women, and children are trafficked worldwide, including right here in the U.S. It can happen in any community, and victims can be any age, race, gender, or nationality. Traffickers might use violence, manipulation, or false promises of well-paying jobs or romantic relationships to lure victims into tracking situations. And again, thank you, Life Preservers Project, a 501c3 nonprofit organization. What is human trafficking? Who are the victims? Who are at risk? Some of the categories: recent migrants and immigrants, youth in foster care or state care, runaway or unhoused youth, individuals with physical or mental disabilities, individuals with unstable housing, LGBTQ+ youth and adults, those who suffered abuse as children, poverty, underserved populations, but not including but not limited to BIPOC. The most common types of human trafficking: labor trafficking, sex trafficking, child brides, and of course, child soldiers. Common industries: care work, nanny, home care, farm construction and industrial work, meat packing, fishing boats, canneries, spa, nail salons, masseuse, sex work, and pornography. Types of human trafficking: state-imposed forced labor, forced sexual exploitation, forced labor exploitation. From the International Labor Organization Protocol to the Forced Labor Convention, 25 million men, women, and children today are in forced labor. 25 million, wow. Trafficked, held in debt, bondage, or working in slavery-like conditions. Every region in the world is affected. Victims often hidden from public view and difficult to identify. $150 billion US is generated in illicit profits. Industries and businesses face unfair competition, and states lose billions in tax income and Social Security contributions. Who are the traffickers? Organized criminal syndicates, families, mom and pop operations, labor subcontractors, pimps, diplomats, business people, professionals, neighbors, friends, relatives of the victims. 14,500 to 17,500 is the estimated number of people trafficked in the US each year. 50% of people trafficked into the US each year are children. 800,000 people are trafficked worldwide, again, each year. East Asia and Pacific is the region that is the largest source of people who are trafficked into the US each year. Barbara, I know you've done a lot of work on this. These are some shocking numbers for a lot of us. Can you kind of walk us through some of them?
Sure. I mean, I think when you look at or try to answer the question, who are the traffickers, and you see this list and the numbers, I mean, the short end of it is that it can be a lot, anyone, and that frankly, human trafficking is a complex crime. And as a former prosecutor, I encountered and worked on matters where, from a distance, you really didn't know exactly what was going on and who the trafficker was. But once you looked beneath the surface, what you found was that the trafficker was somebody who was trying most of the time to profit from that exploitation, and typically that was a full-time job. Whether it's labor trafficking or sex trafficking, a lot of the cases that we prosecuted and that I encountered were cases involving traffickers who spent almost all of their time controlling, exploiting, committing fraud, and sometimes the schemes were actually pretty complicated in order to effectuate the crime.
And two, looking through, and I think a lot of us think of human trafficking largely as that kind of pimp relationship, as the sexual trafficking. But to see the numbers in terms of domestic servitude, agriculture, factories, and other things, again, it's just jarring to think that exists. And I don't think I'm seeing it in the world. It's out there, and I don't think I'm aware of it at all.
Right. So it's interesting. I think that most people feel that way, and then once you hear and hear about trafficking, understand what it is, you all of a sudden, this light switch goes on, and unfortunately, you begin to see potential indicators everywhere. Really, small towns, big cities, overseas, in the United States, and I can tell you, for example, in South Florida, we had cases involving migrant workers. When you think about Florida being such a huge agricultural area, that makes perfect sense. But a lot of people aren't necessarily paying attention to how the farms are working, how the migrant workers are working, but the indicators are there. You may have in Miami, lots of people have domestic workers in their home. And again, there's a very nice area nearby called Key Biscayne, where it really is a high percentage of people that have overseas workers living with them. Again, they're everywhere. Walking around in the strollers in their uniforms with the children. Cases where we went and executed search warrants and conducted interviews relating to trafficking. Neighbors really didn't know, didn't think about it. They weren't looking for it. So it is kind of that mindset of being able to understand what it is. And once you do that and you're paying attention, unfortunately, you will see much more of it.
One of the things I'd like to chime in on that too, Barbara, is a prior slide, Andrew, if you could go back to the one that had the people and the vulnerabilities, this one. Really, when we think about who could be trafficked, what we've seen as we do our work here in Tallahassee and in our surrounding communities, which, as Barbara said, we've got rural areas, we've got, cities, we've got all kinds. It's not just in the giant kind of urban areas where this happens. What we know is that traffickers target people who have vulnerabilities, who are vulnerable in any way, whether it's for sex trafficking or labor trafficking. In our community, we have about a 20% plus poverty rate, and that layer onto that somebody who's a runaway, a child who maybe has been sexually abused, or people from the LGBTQIA plus population. These are vulnerabilities that keep them isolated from social supports and other supports. So that's how you could also tell, Andrew. You could basically say, where are the most vulnerable people? One of the things that our organization STAC has done, and hopefully we'll get back into face-to-face, is going to our homeless shelter every week to talk to people there, because we know that they also have multiple vulnerabilities, and traffickers know that too.
Yeah.
And you talk about isolation, when I was doing domestic violence way back when, the first step of almost any domestic violence was isolation, was isolating people from their friends, from their family, from their support network. And after that, it was almost a done deal.
And the tactics are very similar. And to be honest, people also need to realize that traffickers have many different sort of crimes in their trafficking portfolio. So we have seen domestic violence offenders trafficking victims. So the number of sex trafficking cases we have seen since COVID has really been abusers forcing their victims to into prostitution. So your expertise on that, Andrew, it'll just layer through. Same thing with anybody listening. The tactics of control can be very similar, even if they aren't domestic violence abusers.
I too had an epiphany when I was watching that video. Back when I was 17, working at restaurants, we had a guy that would bring in dishwashers from the south side of Milwaukee to the north side for us. He had a nice big van. He was good at English. He took care of all their paperwork for them and everything. And at the time, I just thought of him as, a low-income staffing agent. And now as I'm seeing this video, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that sounds a lot like human trafficking. Scary.
That's right. So one of the things that you will also see oftentimes is that sex trafficking and labor trafficking are usually, or can be, I should say, can be in the same area. So for example, we would have migrant workers who maybe were potential labor trafficking victims who were customers for prostitution customers so they were the buyers in the sex trafficking in the same area. So when you start to really understand that human trafficking is a commercial business for these traffickers. I, by the way, prosecuted a number of cases, supervised a number of cases, worked with a great team of people. And in every case, the trafficker, whether it was labor or sex, fancied himself or herself a business person, right? A savvy business person. And what that tells you is their end game is to profit. Or at least the core, not the facilitators, I'm talking about the core traffickers. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's go back to some of these slides for a moment. Where does trafficking happen? Obviously, pretty much everywhere. And I'm sure it happens in the other places too, just obviously based on population, not as much. This sadly really just mimics, again, that population.
That's right.
Why is this important during the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least more than usual? Fair employment practices are globally recognized as a basic human right, regardless of the type of work. Regardless of politics or moral concerns, these individuals earn money that is then put back into the economy. Loss of income by anybody directly impacts the economic recovery. Paying sub-minimum wages, garnishing wages for fees, etc., or simply no longer having clients to serve to create additional economic strains that impacts economic recovery. We know most manual labor jobs will not be filled by higher wage earners who lost their jobs during the crisis. Until and unless fair wage and labor practices are in strict compliance, and the expectation is an increase in labor exploitation.
Hey, Andrew, might I jump in just on a sec on this? Because there are a couple of other points I think that are really important on the COVID piece. From a provider's point of view, we've seen nonprofits hit really hard, and we've had to change the way we do business, so to speak. So we don't have one-on-one communication. And at the same time, particularly with children at the outset of the pandemic, we saw that kids were isolated and they were forced online. So anyone who's a parent, a grandparent, has a child in your life in any way, understand that that was a real big boon to traffickers, because then they do this grooming process where they pose as friends, contemporaries, same age group, whatever, of kids, and befriend them, kind of get close to them. And it's because of the pandemic really that online trafficking, from all reports, has exploded, and that it's the online trafficking of youth, but also of adults, because of the isolation forced by the pandemic, right? And then the other part of it, of course, is that traffickers control the victims by controlling their access to now the vaccines, but also any other kind of, masks, gloves. We've heard how traffickers lied to victims about when it's safe to go out or forced them to go out when it was unsafe, because again, victims don't have any agency. So in addition to the slide that talks about these economic impacts, there's also, again, that same sort of control and lack of agency that victims will have and continue to have now, even with the vaccines being available, because they have, they're desperate to keep whatever money they might be getting, and so on.
And Robin, I mean, you're right on with regard to the sex trafficking, and let me just add on the labor trafficking. I tell folks that I have also a white collar background, that I love fraud, and what I mean by that is fraud is obviously a really big indicator for trafficking, because most traffickers, whether it's labor or sex, are using some sort of fraudulent scam in order to recruit them. They're lying in some way or another about the opportunity. And with COVID, you can imagine that unemployment being such a big issue. Again, use of recruitment for employment online, terms or promises of pay. These are normal ways that traffickers, unfortunately, will use to lure and entice victims. So with COVID being what it is, and people really being more desperate to find work, that is much more likely to work, right? Because people want to believe, and certainly the fraudsters, the traffickers go to great lengths to make this look legitimate. We've worked many cases, fake websites, fake documents, fake paperwork to the State Department, not just in the United States, elsewhere. So there's just what is there, and you hit this earlier, Andrew. There's more. It's vulnerability, right? It's people who are really in a vulnerable spot, and there's more of them. So that obviously can lead to an increase in potential trafficking.
And of course, what we really want to take away from this more than anything is, what can we do? How can we see things? We mentioned grooming, the ability to see grooming as opposed to just awkward behavior or weirdness, I think is such a key element here, that people are being groomed oftentimes far in advance to just normalize and accept what's about to come. Can you speak to us all about, some of the signs of grooming or some of the things that are happening?
So Robin, do you want to take that one?
Sure. In the sex trafficking arena, what we see often is that the grooming is a process of, again, targeting a vulnerability and then exploiting that. So you might have somebody, again, with youth or with anyone, making lots of promises, maybe even inducing, convincing somebody to come with them because they'll be able to travel. They'll maybe be a promise of a good job, maybe as a model or as an actor, and then really pose as their best friend. There are these Romeo pimp traffickers, they're referred to. So the grooming process can be, again, it's that luring in, it's that seduction of somebody, whether it's for sex or for any other kind of labor, huge promises, and then the demanded payback. So and we talk about this, we didn't talk about it in the definition so much, but any child that is induced to perform a commercial sex act of any kind, that could be camming, it could be prostitution, that child is a victim of trafficking. So this grooming process could be a 17-year-old boy talking to a 13-year-old girl and saying, hey, if you have sex, if you do this to my best friend, we're going to have money to go to Disney. That's an act of human trafficking, right? So we see that. We also see traffickers prey on people with disabilities. So they might, even with other kinds of minor developmental disabilities, making them promises. We certainly, if you want to think about cases, as Barbara was saying, in the labor format with, again, the economic desperation, it's saying, here's a contract, you can send money home, you'll be able to feed your children, get them medicine, so please come with me. And then it's very sophisticated, as Barbara knows better than I do, operation as to how they then demand the payback, and then people can't get out, or else they keep them there with the threats and the coercion. So even if you see a nanny with a cell phone in her pocket as she takes the kids to the playground, she is controlled by intense coercion by that trafficker. So she won't say anything. So that grooming, that those promises turn into real threats and harm.
Right. And the only thing I want to add, just for sex trafficking and minors, because I think it's helpful for people to think about it this way. A lot of the victims that we have worked with, or survivors who are minors, really believe that they know someone. It's a different mindset, right? Maybe than my generation, and they think they know someone because they've been chatting with them or communicating with them online. And so a lot of stranger danger was a kind of the thing. It was always like in person. Kids today really do not, and I still do, but I used to do a lot more of presentations for schools, elementary school, junior high, high school kids. They really don't grasp that unless you're specifically talking to them, and saying, if you haven't met the person, they're not your friend. You don't know who they are. You don't know who's behind the screen. But that's a discussion that people really have to have with kids, I think.
Absolutely. The promise of being loved to someone who feels unloved clouds all other visions.
Right. But let me add, we had a number of cases. It's not just kids who are lacking love. Sometimes the vulnerability, and we had many cases where two parents, happy home, but the kid met somebody online who became later a boyfriend, or a friend, somebody that was just really influencing them in a way. And I had parents who were distraught about, what do I do next? So it's really important for everybody to know, going back to your points, Andrew, on those slides, it can happen to anyone's child. And so we all have to be vigilant about online use, especially.
Great information. Now let's head over to the civil liability and remedies. And Greg, I definitely want to get you involved here for sure. Wages, Fair Labor Standards Act, Department of Labor, low rates of restitution collection in criminal cases, another way to achieve justice, civil actions, TVPA and Alien Tort Claims Act, preponderance of the evidence versus beyond a reasonable doubt, compensatory and punitive damages, lawsuits against the third parties alleged to have knowingly benefited from trafficking.
Yeah, Andrew, to build on what you and Robin and Barbara have spoken to, and a phrase that we often hear about trafficking victims is that they're hidden in plain sight. But candidly, what also appears to be hidden in plain sight are some of the tools that Congress and various state legislatures have passed in order to aid what we generally think about as a crime, and that maybe law enforcement and prosecutors and U.S. attorneys should be dealing with. But in reality, as far back as 2003, Congress recognized the enormity of this problem, as is illustrated in the map and the numbers that you've shown us already, and realized that the private bar may play a role here in combating the crime of human trafficking. And in 2003, they first added a civil remedy provision to what was, for the first 3 years, just a criminal law. So interesting enough, in 2000, we get the TVPA, Trafficking Victims Protection Act, that is reauthorized in 2003 to add the civil remedy. But before the TVPA in 2000, we really didn't have a law that sort of told us what human trafficking was, that it's a little bit more nuanced these days, that we have this coercion and fraud element of control rather than the brute force that folks might have expected traditionally in a trafficking type context. And so when they passed the civil remedy, they expanded it in 2008 in a way that I think opened the door to allow lawyers who represent survivors to bring claims not just against the trafficker, but anyone who facilitated the trafficking, and that would include third parties, corporations, which is why I think 2008, with that expansion to the should have known standard, the constructive knowledge standard for civil liability under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, that any business at that point in time needed to determine whether or not they could be profiting from something that is a sex trafficking venture. And I think it is incumbent upon the hospitality industry, the tech industry, the agricultural industry, so on and so on, to determine whether or not anyone within their supply chain, whether it be staffing or anyone that is using their platforms or properties, is using those in a way to commit the crime of sex trafficking, and that because of the expansion of the civil remedy, that survivors whose traffickers have never been prosecuted for whatever reason, and maybe because of that burden of proof we talked about a second ago, that beyond a reasonable doubt is a little higher burden than preponderance of the evidence, which would be the civil standard, that even those survivors whose traffickers were never held criminally accountable can confront their traffickers in a civil lawsuit, but maybe in a more meaningful way have a means for a recovery to a new and free life through what we call the financial beneficiary claims against folks or businesses that knowingly financially benefited from something they knew or should have known was a sex trafficking venture.
And as a consumer of these industries, what can we do? What can we be looking for to making sure that they are protecting these vulnerable people?
Well, I think we have seen some change here recently, but obviously one doesn't have to go so far back on online reviews to see that, at least in, say, the hotel context, that a business traveler or someone may be staying someplace for one night and be so disturbed by what they are seeing in the parking lot or in the hallways that they go online and post a review. But the hotel itself had never really trained its staff in how to recognize the sign of human trafficking. So, like even your story before from an early job in your life, where you may have been witnessing something that could have been trafficking, but had no idea what human trafficking was. It's more about educating the public, and for businesses, it's more about knowing what the law requires of you and how you may have liability if you fail to implement policies and procedures that can prevent trafficking from occurring either within your labor supply chain or on your property or on your platform.
Could also chime in too, as consumers, we have the ability to understand where our goods and services are coming from. And one of the things we do here locally is we have an event every year called Imagining Freedom, where local restaurants and farmers and others contribute food to create meals and a wonderful event that we use specifically to say these are all people that we should patronize. Generally local businesses. We know all of the items that are prepared and that are in the supply chain are trafficking free. And people, all of a sudden, you mentioned earlier, Andrew, how can we take action? Well, that's a very simple way. We also know that there are states like California, at least I know California has a Transparency Act that states specifically that they're asking certain corporations to disclose whether or not they're in compliance with that. There are all ways for us as we can use our consumer dollars not to support trafficking, even when it's hidden deep within a supply chain. And it's good too, there have been stories from, fishing and shrimping industries to, the tomato industry in Immokalee, where there has been horrific trafficking and exploitation of workers. And really, we have a duty to pay attention to what's going on. And that's one way we can make a difference.
And I mentioned to the group earlier, it's a little bit strange when you go to the grocery store and you see all the eggs. There's all these certifications about how the chickens were treated, whether they were free range or cage, whatever. There's no commentary whatsoever on how their workers are treated or where they're coming from. Just a sad statement.
Right. And I'll tell you, Andrew, I think just to really drive it home, I think you heard from Greg, companies, businesses, there's liability that they're concerned about. But there, and of course, some people want to do the right thing, of course. They don't always know. They're not well informed. But also, right, people are in business to profit. And so to reiterate the importance of consumers and their role, whether it's a hotel, whether it is just in buying products or items or at the grocery store, that if you're informed and you make decisions based on whether or not there's a clear chain of supply, or an interest in anti-trafficking by the producer of that item, that's really powerful stuff.
Well, I think obviously the saddest fact here and why the crime of human trafficking is growing at the rate that it is, and it's almost hard to even verbalize, is that the commodity is a person. And unlike drug trafficking, when a drug trafficker sells their drug, they've got to go get more supply of that commodity to sell. In the context of a human trafficking, once they have gained control through whatever means, force, fraud, or coercion, of a person, then they have something that they will use over and over and over again to profit in a way. And in order to do that, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening in our society, and therefore, to maximize, quote unquote, what Barbara referred to as these folks that are traffickers refer to themselves as business people, to maximize their profits, they are using other industries and other platforms to advertise, sell, distribute a person that they view as a commodity, and it is incumbent upon us as lawyers to see where within the law there are remedies for the survivors and other ways to lift someone from victim to survivor. And so obviously, Robin and her organization is on the ground day in, day out. Prosecutors like Barbara was are doing the hard work to identify who the traffickers are, put them away. But we as private lawyers, there's a variety of ways that we can assist these folks, whether it is helping with an expungement where someone was charged with a crime by law enforcement who didn't realize that they were really a victim of trafficking, name changes for protection purposes, immigration issues for folks that are vulnerable by virtue of their lack of documentation. There is just a whole host of ways beyond civil causes of actions and beyond criminal prosecutions that the private bar can engage in this process to educate their clients, number one, about the issue and the risk of liability, and then separately to just assist survivors who are in need of resources beyond those that a advocacy organization can provide.
And Greg, I know too, in terms of helping these people, in terms of lifting them up, oftentimes the system is set up that feels like it's almost going to re-victimize them. Can you help explain to us a little bit how we can help them without that re-victimization, without having them go through the story over and over again and kind of reliving that?
Yeah, and this is a lesson that I have learned over the years of my practice, sometimes in a hard way, that I may be the most well-intentioned person in the world with what I'm trying to do for someone that has come to me for representation, but because I did not have a victim-centered or trauma-informed approach, that my words may have done harm or re-traumatized someone. So one of the things that I have learned through my child sex abuse work, and now more recently on work on behalf of human trafficking survivors, is that everyone in my office has received trauma-informed training, so that we either associate someone who has that type of training when we engage with the survivor, or that we ourselves have had that training, so that anything that we do in an effort to help someone doesn't unintentionally harm them. So victim-centered, trauma-informed, recognizing all the various aspects to a claim and who may be able to assist that person, social services-wise, lawyer-wise, types of law that would be involved, whether it's a family law matter, a domestic matter, immigration matter, a criminal matter. What are all the various spokes off the wheel, so to speak, that we can assist this survivor with?
Absolutely. And so much of that too is about the way we define success. As young lawyers, we often define success as the verdict, as winning. That's not always success. It's what does that person want to get from it? What are they willing to go through? It really is just, like you say, a more victim-centered approach to understanding what winning and losing is.
Absolutely. And Andrea, I'll tell you, there were many cases where the survivor did not want to pursue prosecution, and we were obligated to really seriously consider, ultimately, frankly, in some cases, we can proceed without the survivor in certain circumstances. But certainly our priority, the directive by the Department of Justice is clear. Our priority is the survivor. It is a victim-centered approach is in the statute. It is something that has true meaning. And there were cases that we frankly did not prosecute, which is why what Greg does is so important, because there are many reasons why cases are not ultimately prosecuted. I do also have some thoughts. It's just been very thought-provoking, obviously, to hear, Robin and Greg talk about, the survivor's needs. And I'm not sure if you want me to wait or not, but just I've been asked a lot about pro bono work and what lawyers can do, and I have some thoughts on that.
Please go ahead.
Okay. So in fact, I've had a number of conversations with folks probably in the last couple of months. And so the key points are human trafficking is a complex crime. As Greg has pointed out, trauma-informed type of training is super important. And we have organizations like Robin's organization that have very specific roles, and many people who work with survivors who have gone through very extensive training and have had years of experience, which in an ideal world, right, that's what you want for the survivor, is to go through this process where you're limiting the amount of trauma that they're going through, and that you're relying on people who have a lot of experience with it. And even then, by the way, we all see mistakes or make mistakes because every survivor is different, their needs are different. So how does this translate into attorneys who want to do something to help survivors? My advice from my experience, both as being a prosecutor and also working in private practice now, seeing how pro bono projects work, is that to really have a trafficking pro bono program, for example, you have to be willing to do a lot of different things. So I think in other pro bono type areas, you can really say, we're going to help people, for example, with certain immigration visas, for example. And you just do that and it works. But with trafficking, because every survivor is different, because every scam is different, because the victims and survivors' needs are different, they may need just help with the job application. I had a survivor who was applying for school, like a professional school, and needed, has assistance from a lawyer on how to answer some of the questions about the background. There are things you wouldn't think about that I think lawyers are very well suited to do. But if you're saying all we're going to do is work directly with survivors for expungement, for example, that's fine, but understand that it'll be a very limited role. And you may not get as many cases. And unfortunately, a lot of times pro bono programs, their success is measured by how many cases you're getting. So the other thing is that because we do have a lot of non-governmental organizations who specialize in working with survivors, to have younger, newer attorneys, for example, who often are leading pro bono programs, start to work directly with the survivors without any training is really, a bad idea. So going through all of the training and doing all of that.
And if I could just chime in and support you on that, Barbara, there are this slide in particular, and I'll give a shout out to Legal Services of North Florida here in Tallahassee. This really came from one of the things that their human trafficking fellow and attorney that was dedicated to this talked about. These are all things that she did, and these are all things that are in lawyers' wheelhouses, if you will, for them to help. So we've had to go directly to legal services and also to private counsel and just say, we need help with, somebody's got a really weird thing in her car insurance policy and she's having trouble getting something done. So there are all those kinds of things, but here's just some ideas so anybody who's on the call can know, do you have expertise in any of that? And then how important it is for you to really be working with advocates like at STAC and like at other places that understand how to really kind of wrap services around a survivor, because as Barbara was saying, proceeding with a criminal case might not be what that survivor wants or needs. It might not be safe, and really our job is to keep the survivor in the driver's seat of their own lives. And so these are really crucial things, just some ideas about how survivors have needed help, trafficking survivors. And as Greg said, expungement, absolutely, those are crucial. But know that really, I would kind of challenge anybody to say, what is your area of practice and how would that not be helpful to a trafficking survivor? Because I think it's going to be there. I mean, it just what you all are doing here now, trying to find deep pockets, trying to, get at assets when, say, a criminal restitution order is converted to, for civil enforcement. There's so many things that lawyers can do.
Right. I just go ahead. No, I was just going to say that I think that is right on and really important. So many different areas of the law. We would, when I was a prosecutor, we would get a lot of referrals from other attorneys, immigration attorneys, folks who were involved in real estate. They knew they had seen something, they didn't know what. And so really, and not only do you have something that you can bring to the table as a lawyer, but you're probably also potentially coming across trafficking in areas and ways that you may not even know. So super, super important to think about all of that.
And looking through this list, of course, all those people who are easy prey to traffickers because they were an at-risk category, when they leave a human trafficking situation, they're even more risk and need these services. I want to jump over real quick to the Q&A. We've got a question. How do hotels do a better job of telling who sex traffickers are? Let's say they're in the DC area. I know from my time in DC, K Street was full of escorts until 6 a.m. And at 6 a.m., minivans came around and picked them all up. It was just a standard process that, like I say, before 6 a.m., you'd see 30, 40, 50 people on the streets just selling. So how do hotels do a better job of enforcing that? Again, in that scenario, when they're going to hotels, it's somewhat obvious by the way they're dressed.
Greg, do you want to start?
I will start. I mean, in reality, and as a plaintiff's lawyer, I can tell you that if you are a business and you don't want to, I mean, even if you're thinking traditional notions of premises liability, it is incumbent upon any business to deter crime on its premises. So whether or not it is that an escort or a trafficking victim, in both contexts, you're dealing with a potential criminal element, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking, prostitution, any of those types of crimes, could create liability if ignored. But especially important as it relates to identifying survivors. And this is what I think the Department of Homeland Security has been sort of behind for a long time, is the education about prevention and identification. I mean, we've touched on some of those today. I don't think we can go through an exhaustive list, and this is why I think that it may be incumbent upon corporate America to see to it, if they are somehow connected through statistics to the crime of human trafficking. Well, how do we get out of this cycle? How do we get our industry out of this cycle? And it's by educating those people that work within your industry to know what the signs of trafficking are. I mean, clearly we can obviously know what commercial sex activity might look like in a hotel room with the use of towels, sheets, excessive amounts of condoms and lubricants, that sort of thing. But more subtle ways would be whether or not these individuals, and the traffic in and out of the room, but more subtle ways would obviously be, does this person seem like they're free to leave? Is their head down all the time? Are there markings on the person, tattoos on the person that would be indicative of someone that may be a trafficking victim? So, again, probably a subject of a multi-day training process, but we can certainly touch on those issues. And I'm sure Barbara can speak more intelligently, both as a prosecutor and in private practice, about how it is that those nuances between what may be considered a sex worker versus a trafficking victim.
No, well, definitely not more intelligently, and I agree with everything you've said, Greg. And I will tell you that it's amazing. Just to give you really horrible examples, we did have, luckily they're closed now, but smaller, not as opposed to corporate type hotels, which I'll talk about separately, but smaller motels that were clearly being used repeatedly by traffickers. And we literally had 3 recoveries of minors in 1 year from a particular hotel. Now, that is ridiculous, right? I mean, that's a big problem for those business owners. And so it can be that stark. And part of it is, why should there preliminarily be a distinction for purposes of, are we running a legitimate business, like Greg says, that should be avoiding criminal activity? Prostitution is illegal in almost every state in the United States. So if you are allowing that to happen in your establishment, and there are especially smaller locations where management is on site, people know there's prostitution going on and they're allowing it to happen. And so you are potentially really furthering the potential for trafficking by force, fraud, or because the person's a minor. I think that as far as corporations go and bigger companies where, maybe, you've got CEO people in different places and who's running and, what's happening at the actual hotel. It's like Greg says, you run it like any other business. We, as a compliance team at Holland and Knight, do a lot of training to minimize the risk of fraud, of other types of, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violations, all different types of matters that corporate America really recognizes as a potential risk. But I do find, at least me, I have found that most businesses, I think you said this before, Robin, most businesses do want to do the right thing, but they have priorities, right? They're looking at, where are we going to spend the money to do the compliance and to do the training and to, we have so many other things to do. And frankly, trafficking has not been on the radar. And hence the litigation, because frankly, people have dropped the ball in understanding that maybe you're not doing enough. And maybe we should treat it like everything else that you prioritize. So those are my thoughts.
And Barbara, I'm always afraid of those businesses too that start that rationalization game of, well, my competitor is doing it, I can't compete by doing the right thing. Just a horrible rabbit hole.
Right. Right. And I think nowadays, look, for corporations and businesses, right, it's profit really. I mean, there's many other things I'm sure for certain ones, but profit is it. If you have a scandal where somebody is heinously victimized, as there have been situations, what is that going to do to your business? Does it really make sense? I mean, let's put aside the horror and obviously horrificness of the people part. But if you're thinking in business mind, what's the risk factor here? Although maybe you think the percentage is low, if it does happen, the fallout is horrendous, as well it should be, right? Because we're talking about people being exploited.
Yeah.
And it all goes back to margin, right? Having that civil litigation where you can make them pay so they don't make as much money or maybe go out of business, as well as that publicity aspect of, just looking horrible.
A question just came in, and it's kind of goes to this issue a little bit, but somebody who wants to take action and does suspect that trafficking is happening, what should they do? And one of the things I think about right away is that we do have a national human trafficking hotline, 888-3737-888. And that's a hotline. It's not a hotline. It's not a direct line to law enforcement, although they will connect you to law enforcement if needed. It is not immediately going to, disclose who you are, et cetera. It can be anonymous. It's 24/7, multiple languages. If you suspected it, and number one, if you have a local task force or coalition, I would find out that now, and I would find who your contact was, and I'd call them, and I'd develop a friendship relationship with them. So, if you suspect it, you could talk to them. Could this be trafficking? Might it be, might it not be? Here in Tallahassee, we also have some pretty terrific law enforcement that are sensitive to victims and will do the right thing. And so you could develop those relationships, but you could just call the national hotline and say, I suspect something's going on, but I don't know what to do. Can I talk to you? And that's a resource for you. So I just wanted to say that that's out there as well. And it's probably a good thing to look at the slide as we're getting close to the end as well, and highlight some of these other things. I'm just looking at the Human Trafficking Legal Center. Martina Vandenberg heads that up. It's an amazing resource for lawyers that they have briefs, they have case decisions. They're just a wonderful kind of top of the mark organization for lawyers and anybody who's involved, particularly in civil litigation. You see our other contact information there, but this is something else that I just would emphasize. Lawyers, there are resources there, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are, champions out there like Greg and Barbara who've been in the court system on these cases. So know that that's also, these resources are here for you.
Just one very important point, because on the hotline, Robin mentioned, so it is not run by law enforcement. There are many hotlines out there that are run by law enforcement or by prosecutors. This is not. It's a great hotline. Whether you're calling to report something to law enforcement, they will send a lead if you want them to. But it's also a hotline for survivors who want resources and who do not want to report it to law enforcement. They keep track of everything that comes in. They also monitor trends so that if you start to see the same types of descriptions of schemes, it's a wonderful thing. And I'm a big advocate of the National Human Trafficking Hotline because it is really meant to be a resource for survivors.
And the question really has an interesting, situation there of, do we call the police? Because if the police come and they end up not separating that person from the trafficker, are we signing them up? Are they going to be blamed for you were the one that called the police? Should we call the police? Should we call this number? It is kind of
very, and this is to me what I would advise, and I used to advise it all the time. So, well, first of all, if you call the National Resource Hotline and you want it to be anonymous, they will leave it as such, and they'll take the information and still report it. So that's great. Secondly, the hotline is a number to call when you think there may be something there, but you don't know for sure, right? Obviously, if you have an urgent matter and you clearly see it, you call 911. But where you're not, you know, something's not right, and this could be, I literally, would have all sorts of interesting leads to get that were very helpful, just based on a good hunch, if you understand what human trafficking is.
It looks like we have someone with their hand up. If you could ask your question in the Q&A, we'd be happy to address that.
And I will say with advocacy groups and through efforts like Robin's organizations and others, law enforcement has come a long way over the last decade plus in appreciating and understanding what a survivor is too. So like while we have been talking about how corporations and private lawyers need to recognize the signs of human trafficking, I will say that law enforcement in various pockets of the country that may not have even appreciated that it could happen there now are trained on this type of thing. So if you clearly think someone is in danger or grave danger, then like Barbara said, 911 is an option. And then as it relates to something that just looks off and you're not really sure, clearly the trafficking hotline is always an option as well. So.
And yeah, Dan Thompson, looks like you had a question, and we're going to let you speak if you'd like to go ahead and throw it out for us.
Dan, you can just unmute your mic.
Or feel free to email it. There you go.
I want to say that Robin has done a good job, but other than that, no questions.
All right, great, thank you. All right, well, we are at our time, so I want to thank, again, everyone for attending today. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm sure our audience did too. I want to thank our guests. We appreciate all that you have done. And I want to let you know too that we applaud you in all that you will do. I look behind Greg and see pictures of children, and that's really what this is all about. It's not just about the world we're creating, but about the world we're letting be created. We need to be proactive. We need to make sure that we're out there doing good. If you enjoyed the session from the Life Preservers Project, please be sure to follow them. I'm sure you'll enjoy their other events they'll be holding, as well as feel free to follow Page One as we both strive to make human rights more than just a fee on our bar dues. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and I really appreciate it.